Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Again, thank you so much for coming onto this call tonight. We have got an incredible week for you guys. Week 8 of 16, we are halfway there. And I have to say, guys, some of the recordings that we've had and some of the people over the last 7 weeks, you got to go back and listen to those recordings that are on every blast that we send it out, sitting on all the Facebook pages and groups, because there's some really gems, some really unbelievable information if you just listen for the 30 minutes of the information that we're sharing with you on this process as we go through to 16 weeks. Dr. Paul Clayton, thank you so much for coming on tonight. It's truly another pleasure to have you on the call with us.
It's a pleasure for me also, Rob.
Thank you, Paul. And Paul, what I'd like to do is just get you to give us a quick snapshot of your history, okay? And, I always say that, give me that 2-minute snapshot, how you fell into balanced oil, how it became part of your life, and how Zenzino has hit the tracks for you over the last number of years.
You're asking me to pour a 50-year story into 2 minutes. Well, I'll do my best. Well, I've been involved in what used to be called natural pharmacology. That is the pharmacological attributes of food and food extracts for half a century. I was trained as a clinical pharmacologist and did a lot of work actually with the pharmaceutical industry before the scales fell from my eyes. And I began to understand that the therapeutic effects of food and food extracts were so much more powerful. I had been working with a small company called Oil for Life, who had developed a kind of a precursor to balance oil. And Zenzino came along one day and swallowed that little company up, like the whales swallowing Jonah. And I was a little piece of the office furniture. I came along with it, had a meeting with Doug and Orion, and they said, well, what do you think? Should we work together? What could we do together? And I said, if you bring me on and give me the right support, we could become, instead of being a coffee company, which they were at that time, we could become a life science company and a multinational life science company. We could go toe-to-toe with the biggest players in this space. I was very confident about that because I knew even then, no, actually long before then, what the potential of pharmaconutrition actually was. And I have to give Doug and Orion all the credit for this. They recognized the case that I was making, welcomed me on board, and gave me enough room to play and to help to develop the health protocol and a couple of other things besides, which are now really making waves, not just in the direct marketing area, but actually in terms of public health in some countries, it's gotten to that scale. So it's been a really interesting and exciting ride. We're still in the very early stages if you look at our share of the global market, because the global market is where we're going to be. And I'll make one more point. I'm probably getting close to 2 minutes. One of the reasons why this is so important is that everywhere you look, the current model of healthcare is actually failing. And I talk to doctors in many, many countries all around the world. They all say the same thing. The current model that we use, which is reactive, we wait till people get sick, then try to paper over the cracks with drugs, which are expensive, they're toxic, they don't cure, they just treat symptoms. It's really expensive. It's getting more expensive as more people get more sick. And in the background, due to the stupidity and corruption of our political classes in the West, our economies are failing. So in other words, we're reaching the point of failure. We can't afford to go on as we are. And you're seeing increasing healthcare rationing in many different countries. You're seeing various medical facilities actually disappearing altogether. We need a new system. And in this new landscape that I and others can already begin to see, pharmaconutrition is going to be a key component, maybe the leading component. And at the moment in Zenzino, we are the lead player in this new space. So our future, I think, is almost without limits.
Paul, you mentioned a great point there, and it's what's happening in the world today. Let's just tap on that just for a couple of minutes, okay, because it is a very, very fundamental part of where we're heading as a company, okay? Again, we know the products are really not on trial. We've seen too many results. Let's talk about just where the world is today, okay? Now, you've been around a couple of years, okay? So you've seen a lot of change, a lot of changes, okay? I know you're not as old as me. I'm 61, okay? But, what I've seen in this wellness world, in this space for the last 25 years, and the way it's really grown, or it's matured to a good point. But what I've watched is the world getting more sicker, which is simply what you've just said as well. And I know we've had the speed bump with COVID, and I believe that was a good wake-up call to the world to get their bodies under control and get themselves, at least their health or their bodies working the correct way. Talk to me about just a little bit about where you see the world is now and how we can assist with some of these products that we've got at Zenzino. We are not the cure for everything, but we can certainly assist on that cellular level. Talk to me where you think we're sitting or poised to move.
The last I would say since 1980, if you actually look at the trend lines, since 1980, public health has been getting almost consistently worse in every metric that you care to examine. In 1980, that's when you start seeing there's a huge increase in overweight and obesity, which brings along with it increased risks of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, cancer. I mean, I'm not fat shaming here. These are simply medical facts. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing is an increase not only in the frequency of, I could list probably 50 major different diseases, but we're seeing a decrease in latency. And many people have heard me talk about this before. We're seeing people presenting with these conditions earlier and earlier in life, which means that the numbers of people who are being funneled into healthcare is increasing drastically. Now, if you go back to what we call blue zones, some of them still exist today, Nicoya, Icaria, Sardinia. And if you look at blue zones in the past, and those people who know my work know I'm talking about the Victorian blue zone, what we find are populations with a life expectancy as good, in some cases better than ours, a health expectancy that is up to 10 or even 15 years better. So they have far less chronic degenerative disease. And from that, you are forced to conclude that the bulk of the burden of healthcare that we see at the public health level today is being driven by lifestyle issues. And most of these are dietary, not all of them. COVID made everything worse. It's pretty clear that the COVID response, well, COVID was never really that much of a threat. Diamond Princess, which was one of the very first phenomena within the COVID wave, showed us that this wasn't a particularly atypical or dangerous disease. The government response was absolutely disastrous, and it is a testimony to the immaturity and stupidity and the lack of class of the current cadres of politicians in the West. We have terrible politicians who no longer represent their constituencies at all, but seem to represent lobbying groups and corporate interests more than anything else. I think in Australia and in New Zealand, the response to COVID was particularly stupid. In fact, it was, I would categorize it as being broadly fascist, or bio-fascist, as some people term it. And the impact of this on people's health has been absolutely disastrous. What we have seen in all of those nations, which had substantial lockdown policies, complete waste of time, by the way, as was masking, what we see is an increase in a whole range of different types of diseases. People got fatter, they were less active. We see an increase in type 2 diabetes, equally worryingly seeing increases in type 1 diabetes. And we're seeing major problems, particularly in children who were forced to isolate and to mask. It's been really damaging for their personal development. And in the United States, the CDC has been forced to push back developmental milestones by very significant periods of time. We have damaged almost an entire generation of children. And what has happened, I think, as a result of that, is that there has been a tremendous loss of trust in the medical profession, a loss of faith. And we have not only lost trust in the doctors who went along with this stupidity, there were some good independent doctors who didn't, and my hat's off to them. Many of them risked their jobs, their salaries, everything, in order to stand by their principles, their integrity, and the real science. But people have also lost faith and belief in the regulators, such as the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, EFSA, the TGA in your neck of the woods. And people have begun to realize that what the limitations of the current healthcare system are. We cannot any longer rely on them to take care of us. We have to take care of ourselves. And what we have done through Zinzino is to provide people with a set of extremely safe and really effective tools that they can use to do just that. I'm going to just quote a rather obscure economist called Herb Stein that probably no one has ever heard of. But Herb Stein is famous in economic circles for having formalized Stein's law. And Stein's law says, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Blindingly obvious, you might say. But for our politicians, perhaps not quite so obvious. But it's very, very clear, given the current increasing demands for increasingly expensive healthcare, and with this economic chaos occurring in the background, we're at that point. It's what the economists call a death cross. And the old order is crumbling. It's only being kept alive in a kind of a zombie condition by the stakeholders, the vested interests, who, as you know, are the pharmaceutical industries, the insurance companies, and some of the more boneheaded medical professional groupings. That is changing. If something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And we are at that point. And I alluded to that earlier. And it creates a very interesting scenario for companies like Zinzino to move into. Now, I say companies like Zinzino, I think at the moment, there aren't any companies like Zinzino. There will be. And what I see in different parts of the world are new companies setting out to copy various elements of the health protocol. And I have no problem with that. I want to help Zinzino. I want to help the people who work with Zinzino, but most of all, I want to improve public health. And I was just talking to, I don't know if you remember this, when COVID broke out, one of the worst areas affected, well, you had Wuhan, parts of China, but in Europe, the worst affected area was Bergamo in Italy. And I was just talking yesterday to the physician who was basically in control of that. And he said, this was an absolute disaster. The government policy was a complete disaster. It was boneheaded, it was wrong, it was counterproductive. And it's very, very clear that they were in the pockets of the drug companies, and they were panicking, and they were misinformed, and they were just stupid. So it's not just the Australian politicians. This is actually a generalized phenomenon. And he said, well, the physicians, we would get COVID fairly frequently, and we treated with hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and all the compounds that we actually know work, whereas the patients who were being processed through the system were being fed dangerous combinations of highly inappropriate medications, being put on ventilators, and they were dying like flies. None of that needed to have happened. The only good thing that has come out of this is, first of all, it's given us an insight into the incredibly destructive and inappropriate behavior of this nexus point where the pharmaceutical industry and governments converge. And it's created this massive wave of public revulsion and distrust. We know this is not the place where we want to be. We need something better. And Rob, we actually have that better thing to offer.
So let's talk about that, Paul, that crossing the bridge, okay? And I believe there's a lot of people, and guys, make sure you listen to this replay. Some of the verbiage that Paul has just disclosed to you, you need to learn and educate yourself on some of these statements, because they are critical points of history now that we've got that we can use to circumvent or make sure people don't repeat what's just happened. So let's talk about the cure now, or the voyage that we got with the health protocol. I truly believe that Zinzino is on the right wave. I know with your science and technology that we're working with, okay, and the future of this company, how we've got to stay ahead of the competition, because there are other test-based companies now popping up. There are other companies that are trying to simulate what we're doing here at Zinzino. But again, I believe with what we've got coming, what you've got in the pipeline and the future, we're going to keep that 3 to 5 years ahead of the rest of the pack, as I would say. Talk to me about now some of what you would say, okay, if you've got diabetes, if you've got this issue, if you've got that issue, talk to me about that health protocol, as we call it. And I know that everything starts with the balance test. We then, we go from the balance test. We then go on to the balanced oil, premium or standard. We then go on to Xenobiotic, and then we go on to Extend and on to Viva. As a health protocol, Paul, how would you direct the public to say, okay, this is what you need to do, knowing that we've just been through that 3 years of total turmoil?
Well, I'm not sure I would prioritize any one of the elements of the health protocol. I mean, each of them is effective on its own, but they're designed to work together. It's an interlocking series of shields, which when you put them together, give you an extraordinarily effective way of stepping outside the disease-causing system that currently exists. And it puts you in, once you get onto the health protocol, in my view, you become your own personal blue zone. That's the point. So let me just quickly, go through how that all operates, and then perhaps we can talk about the individual components. If you're living in 2023, as most of you are, and if you're living in a developed nation, I think as most of you are, then it's very likely that you're going to be, with the exception of professional athletes and really die-hard fitness fanatics, marathon races and things like that. Most people, most urbanites and metropolitan people today are getting by at about 2,000 kilocalories a day, which is unprecedentedly low. We're physically very, very inactive. One of the least physically active generations that has ever existed. So we're eating less than our recent ancestors, our great-grandparents and so on, used to eat. And the foods that we are eating are really badly designed. They contain a lot of empty calories, sugars, starches, plant oils. They're effectively empty calories. That creates, amongst other things, chronic inflammatory stress. Chronic inflammatory stress leads to the progressive destruction of healthy tissue. Balance oil switches off chronic inflammatory stress through mechanisms that you can read about in my blog or find elsewhere. If you're getting by on this very small quantity of food, and a lot of that is empty calories, you're going to be depleted in a lot of vitamins, minerals, very phytonutrients, a lot of other things as well. Extend replaces all of those and brings your levels up, not to pharmacological levels, pharmaceutical levels, we don't want that, but up to the top of the healthy range. In fact, the profile that you find in the blue zones that I was talking about before. In terms of dysbiosis, which is where xenobiotic comes in, here's a few historical facts. We know that in the Mesoamerican cultures, pre-Christian cultures, people were consuming about 100, 120 grams of prebiotic fiber a day. We know what they ate. We know how much fiber. That was about a quarter of their calories, maybe a fifth. They had a microflora, a microbiota in the colon that was overwhelmingly gram-positive. And these bugs were chewing up the fermentable carbohydrates, producing, amongst other things, butyrate. And butyrate is a powerful anti-inflammatory agent. It's really, really good at killing off cancer cells, which obviously is a good thing. And it impacts on the central nervous system. It just makes you happier, makes you more functional. You have less neuroinflammation. I mean, these people were eating an extraordinarily healthy diet. Come forward 1,000 or 2,000 years to, let's say, 1850, your intake of prebiotic fibers has dropped to between 30 to 40 grams from 120. You're still gram-positive dominant, which is where you want to be. How much of these fibers are we eating now? Because of the frankly immoral and grotesque activities of the multinational food companies, we're now consuming perhaps 2 to 4 grams of prebiotic fibers, which means we're predominantly gram negative. You've starved out the good bacteria, their place has been taken by the bad ones. They are now producing chronic inflammatory stress, endotoxemia, one of the reasons why at the moment between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 people worldwide have non-alcohol related fatty liver disease. So xenobiotic is designed to restore the fiber content. So each of the elements of the health protocol is designed very specifically to neutralize or act as an antidote to one of the ways in which the modern lifestyle drives disease. We're not a supplement company. Supplements don't work. It's been proved time and time again. We're certainly not a pharmaceutical company. Pharmaceuticals don't cure as a rule, and they're too damn toxic and too expensive as well. We're in the middle. We found a path through, if you don't mind me quoting a little bit of classicism at you, between Scylla and Charybdis, we've found a way, a short and easy and safe and effective way to better health for the masses. Not going to work for everybody. It's not going to work for those people with genetic risk factors, but that's about 10%. But we can deal with 90%. And I think that's a pretty good place to start.
So, Paul,
Rob,
from that,
I know you were on the phone to your bookie right now. That's inappropriate. Come on.
No, sorry, there was just somebody trying to get into the call and they had the wrong link.
Right.
Paul, okay, so we know that Xenobiotics is one of the best products out there. Okay, it's doing incredible results. Okay, a lot of people talk about the gluten-free part of it. Why is the big concern about gluten-free?
There is undoubtedly a substantial number of people who are gluten intolerant and who develop very serious gastrointestinal problems if they consume too much of it. There's a very much larger number of people who think they have gluten intolerance, who probably have other gastrointestinal issues, but who put it down to gluten intolerance. And this has created a healthy market for gluten-free produce in the food marketplace. It's a healthy market, but these are not healthy foods, because very often when you make up a processed gluten-free food, you end up creating other types of nutritional deficiencies. So gluten avoidance, I kind of understand it, but it's difficult to do that in a healthy way. If you merely have dysbiosis because of this reduction of prebiotic fiber that I was talking about, that creates symptoms which can actually mimic gluten intolerance. So I would say that for anyone who thinks they're gluten intolerant, if it hasn't been absolutely confirmed, and there are diagnostic tests which can do this, then try Xenobiotic, and you might find that that clears up all of your problems, in which case you didn't have gluten intolerance to start with. If you do have gluten intolerance and you take Xenobiotic, it's not going to make the situation worse because Xenobiotic does not contain gluten. So this is a fairly risk-free way that you can test yourself to find out whether your problems are due to gluten intolerance or not. If they respond, if you start getting better, you didn't have gluten intolerance. If there is no effect, yep, you probably do have gluten intolerance and you need to go down a different road.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm hearing from a number of the wellness professionals. Okay, but again, I'm going to quote 98% of the people that get on Xenobiotic always have an outstanding result. Truly have an outstanding result.
It's probably one of the formulations I'm proudest of. It looks very simple, but it was actually a very complex set of calculations to get this right. The different fibers have to be present in the right proportions, and you have to take into account gastrointestinal transit times, fermentation rates, therapeutic indices. It was, it was complicated. But at the end of the day, we have something that's very simple, very effective, very safe, and actually tastes pretty good. When I'm in a hurry, I just take a spoonful of the powder, and it's got this slightly sweet, slightly kind of nutty kind of flavor. My kids back in London, back in the UK, they take it, they give it to their kids.
Now, I want to track on that because I get a lot of phone calls about children and pregnant mothers consuming these products, okay? And if we could start with the balanced oil first up and lead into Xenobiotic, for an example, talk to me about the safety zone of whether you believe people pre-birth and then obviously having children and then going into children as well, whether they should be consuming the Xeno products.
Well, I'm not sure that pre-birth customers should be drinking balanced oil, but their mums should be. Because while the child is in the womb, the central nervous system is developing, it needs omega-3s, absolutely. And if the mother isn't consuming enough of them in the diet, the fetus will try and steal them from the mum, and they remove them from the mother's brain. And that's why a lot of mums will get what they call baby brain. The brain actually physically shrinks because the baby's stealing the omega-3s from it. And hopefully that recovers after birth if the mother's eating the right types of foods. But if the mother is taking balanced oil during pregnancy, then the baby developing in her womb is going to have a key advantage. And I tell you, Rob, I've been to a lot of seminars and conferences where parents will come in. Many of them might have had infertility issues before, and it's now been resolved because they're on the health protocol. and they bring the babies in. And I've seen so many of them. I can recognize them now. And you see these little things. Sometimes they're absolute newborns, and sometimes they're 6 months or a year or a couple of years old. And the one characteristic they have is you see them looking around. They're interested, they're aware, they're alert, but they're not fussing. They're not crying and screaming and causing a situation. These are like little samurai warriors. They're calm, they're alert, ready to take appropriate action. They're impressive. And I've seen a lot of them now.
We've found that as well. We've got a number of people that are wellness professionals in Australia, for an example, and they work in the baby area, and babies or mothers that are consuming the Zenzino products and the result of the child versus children that don't take it at all, or the parents that don't take it, dramatic difference in the children, like you just said. The ones that are not taking it are hyper, ADHD, they're jumping around, they're really left field type children, as where, like you said, the ones that are calm, astute, know what's happening in the world, their brains thinking, have all been on the balanced oil or on an omega product of some type.
They have a heck of a head start. And what we're beginning to see now, because we've been around for long enough, is that when these kids get to the age where they're starting to go into the school, it could be the kindergarten or early prep school, they're doing really well there as well. So I'm very proud. I'm very proud of this. But let me go on to answer your question in a more general sense. Is there any age or group or I think most age you were talking about mostly, who should not be taking xenobiotic? No, traditionally, we have always consumed much larger amounts of prebiotic fiber than we do today. So it's not as if you're exposing people to some dangerous new drug. We're just putting back into the system what always used to be there in the past. So I think once a baby has been weaned, you can start mixing xenobiotic into its food from the get-go. Obviously, only in small amounts. You have to be sensible about this. Whereas for an adult, you might start with a scoop, which is about 8 or 9 grams. With a newbie, you might start with maybe just a quarter of a teaspoon. I mean, you might be interested to know that the major manufacturers of infant formula are starting to put these prebiotic fibers into their products as well, because they understand how important it is to get the right kind of microbiota, because that is also important in terms of brain development and even personality development. There's this very complicated gut-brain connection, which goes in both directions, which goes through the bloodstream, it goes through the vagus nerve, probably through other mechanisms as well. And getting the right type of microbiota in the colon is really, really important for the child's well-being and development. Probably, I would think, not just in the early years, but through the teenage years as well.
Fantastic. Paul, let's just, as we wrap out for the last 3 to 4 minutes, we know that we've got coming out in the next month or so, some of the studies that you've been working on, some of the sort of analysis that we can start using Zenzino as a testimony, where we've just been using the omega and the brand of Zenzino. Talk to us about a couple of the studies that are coming out that's going to be released in the next month or so.
Well, we have a bit of a problem there, because one of the big studies that we set up, which was in Vilnius, in the university hospital there, it was absolutely and completely disrupted by COVID. And the hospital more or less closed down. The Lithuanians, I think, took a fairly inappropriate approach to this whole problem. And a lot of the people who had been coming into the hospital for testing could no longer attend. So that study rather fell apart. We're trying to find ways of starting it up again. What we do know is that some of the people who, this was about essential hypertension, who started receiving balanced oil, they effectively became drug-free. Now, we'd already seen this. There's no surprise here. We see this routinely in customers, but this was being experienced in a formal in a clinical format. And I mean, it's just a huge disappointment to me that the trial was messed up in this way. We're trying to pull whatever data can be salvaged from that, and we are talking about restarting the study. It's a shame because we had some of the most advanced monitoring systems in place that have ever been put into one of these types of trials. And the preliminary data that was starting to come out was phenomenally good. I think we're going to have to go back to there. I'll talk again to the physicians in charge. And if they are interested and able to commence the study, I think that's what we're going to do. We have other studies that are starting up now. I'm going to be in the Czech Republic in a month's time. And we have a very well-known specialist in Alzheimer's there who is convinced, I think from on the basis of what he's already seen, that we have a way of potentially slowing the development of Alzheimer's, potentially stabilizing it, and potentially starting to see recovery of functionality. Because with Alzheimer's, you get tissue that's dead, we can't fix that. The tissue, if it's just dying because of an incorrect sort of environment within the brain, if we can change that environment, we can allow the nerves to regenerate. I'm very convinced that we can do this, and we've seen some cases where this clearly has happened. And a colleague of mine called Alan Bredesen, who's at UCLA, and has already published a couple of papers where he used a slightly different protocol to achieve restoration of cognitive function in people with early diagnosis Alzheimer's. I happen to think we're ahead of the game in the sense that we have a more potent pharmaconutritional program than anything that Alan has used, but he is a trailblazer. He's published the first results, and we're hoping to build on that.
Fantastic. Now, what about the sporting ones? I hear that there's Dr. Collins been working on some sporting ones as well. Are you involved or across those?
I'm involved in those to some extent. One of the molecules that he was looking at was dihydroberberine, and that was always, to be honest, my second choice. The point is that this is a compound that has the ability to phosphorylate, which means activate AMPK, and it's known in the business as an exercise mimic. I had already been working with a compound called active AMP, which is an extract from an edible succulent called Joannistemna pentaphyllum. And we already had data out of South Korea showing that this could lead to a reduction, a loss of deep abdominal adipose tissue, which is what you want to do, because this is the type of adipose tissue that we know is not particularly good for your long-term health. I'd actually had some experience with it myself. I'd used it. I'd noticed the difference. I realized that some of my physical measurements, for example, in terms of my best time for 500 meters or how many push-ups I could do, significantly increased when I used this. We were on the verge of rolling this out, and then one very small and very irrational country in the EU said, hang on, we're not so sure about this. Every other country had said yes. They'd looked at the data. They said this is safe. This is a traditional food. This one country stuck its foot in the door, and I'm almost certain it was pressurized to do so by a large pharmaceutical company, and put a stop to that whole rollout. Now, we may still go back to that. We might, for example, come out with a product at some point which says not available in this one particular country. But that creates various problems. When you've got a direct marketing company, there's cross sales which tend to cross borders. Who knows where your downline is going? So we're not entirely sure whether we can do that. Dihydroberberine is, as I said, a second choice. It has certain problems. The results are so-so. We got something, but it's not exactly as much as I wanted. I don't know whether we're going to go with that. There are potential third candidates, which we'll probably be testing as well. The importance of this is that we can stop chronic inflammation. We can restore type B malnutritional issues. We can correct dysbiosis. The fourth major driver of chronic ill health is glycemic mismatch, and that is what the AMPK upregulators are designed to tackle. So we haven't stopped looking for the ideal product to do this. That will be the final element in the health protocol. Dihydroberberine may still come through. It may be that fourth component, but I'm committed to rolling out products which are really safe, which are really effective. These things have got to be foolproof. And I'm not yet entirely convinced that dihydroberberine is the way to go. We may end up with a third candidate.
Okay, fantastic. Great information. Well, guys, we're at the 30-minute point, and we like to just make these a nice, short and sharp presentation. Dr. Paul, any closing comments that you'd like to leave us with? I know you made the key point about all of our products synergistically work together. I want people to really understand that, because a lot of companies don't do that. They put an A in and a B in and they all don't work synergistically together. All of our Balance Oil family, our Xenobiotic, all of our wellness products that are attached through the health protocol, all synergistically been designed to work together. Can you just touch on that as you give some final comments?
Sure. Well, the supplement industry is involved in selling snake oil, not fish oil, because we know that commercial fish oil doesn't work. The Cochrane collaboration says so. And we know the vitamin and mineral tablets, they don't work either. They've been tested 6 ways from Sunday. They don't produce any positive outcomes at all. So we're different from them in that respect. What we have done instead is to, instead of trying to plug holes in a very leaky, bad boat, which in some ways is what the supplement companies are trying to do, we started off by identifying the main ways in which the modern diet and lifestyle, the modern world, is making us so sick. We've identified 4 major drivers. We have products which will neutralize or act as specific antidotes to the first 3. The 4th is the one that we're still working on. So what we have are 3 products, each of which is effective in its own right. But when they put them together, you're reversing the metabolic and nutritional deterioration that characterizes the last half century. And you're putting your body, your metabolism, into a time machine. You're sending it back 100 years into the past, when people ate a very, very much healthier diet. And when we know that people were much healthier as a result. Forget everything you've ever read about how people used to live much shorter lives than we do. That's mostly propaganda. It's mostly based on things like infant mortality, which skew the statistics. For anyone who's interested, look at my papers on the Victorian era, which I co-published with Judith Robotham. You can find them in PubMed. Or for those people who want to look at more recent material, and there's a lot of it, please feel free to visit my blogspot, which is drpaulclayton.eu, drpaulclayton.eu. And there you'll find a list of my current interests and obsessions. And all of these posts are intensively referenced. So for the skeptics, and every good scientist should be a skeptic, have a look at the original references, see whether you think I've got them right or not, use them to jump off into the wider literature. And if you spot anything wrong, let me know. The more aggressive and the more hostile the criticism, the more I like it. That's how science progresses, and that's how it should progress.
Fantastic, Dr. Paul, and truly appreciate your time, energy, and effort for coming on tonight. drpaulclayton.eu. Guys, it's an incredible site, blog site to get up there. There's so much open information. It is crazy, okay? So, Paul, thank you for putting that blog site together, drpaulclayton.com. Subscribe.
No. drpaulclayton.eu.
DEU, my apologies, drpaulclayton.eu. Make sure you jump onto that site, share that site, and get the information that's up there as well. Also, don't forget zenzino.blog. There's a lot of great information up there about all different topics as well. Paul, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I appreciate your efforts and your just constant information that you can update us with. Everybody that's on tonight, we've got all different types of people, from medical doctors down to wellness professionals, down to brand partners and customers on the call from around the world. Thank you so much. Look forward to speaking to you again real soon. Hey, and stay safe.
Been my pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, mate. Bye-bye. Thank you, guys.